Chapter 22. The Theatah. The Dahnse. Most social gatherings I could do without, I have said. By that I meant all women's teas, luncheons, evening bridge parties, all New Year's Eve celebrations, and all large parties. I lived to eat those words. In fact, I lived to eat them over and over again like a cud. For by the time I had lived on the chicken ranch for a couple of years, I would have crawled on my hands and knees over broken glass to attend the annual reunion of the Congenital Idiots Association. Entertainment offered us chicken ranchers was Saturday night dances from 27 to 25 miles away, moving pictures in nearby towns, seasonal entertainments at the schools, interesting only to the parents of the participants, monthly basket socials given by the churches. These socials were owned and operated by Bertie Hicks and her ilk and were for the sole purpose of gossiping and eating. Occasional private parties such as the Indian picnic or the birthday party for Mrs. Kettle and the county fairs. Bob and I referred to anything social as either the Theatah or the Dahnse due to the unusual contact we had made during our first year on the ranch. It was a bright fall day and we had been out trolling for salmon. We had just returned Sharky's boat and were walking down the beach to the car when we noticed a woman and some children digging clams. The woman was clad in a few shreds of hip boots, men's trousers, a gunny sack apron, a purple knitted shawl, and two long, dusty brown braids swinging from her head. With her were 4 children, a couple of them by necessity on all fours. They were all filthy and not bright. It was not an inspiring encounter, and Bob and I quickened our pace, but to no avail, for the woman straightened up and hallooed to us. We stopped and she hurried up. "I'm Mrs. Weatherly," she said with a great air, "and this is Mary Elizabeth." She indicated the biggest and blackest of the children. "Pamela Lorraine." This one was a drooling crawler. "John Frederick." His eyes only opened a tiny crack, so he could tip his head way back to see us. "And baby, Charles Lawrence." Charles Lawrence was eating a raw clam. We started to introduce ourselves, but she waved it with, "Oh my goodness, I've heard all about you. I knew the day you moved out here." "I even know," she waved a dirty finger at me, "that you are expecting." My God, I thought. I hope it won't be marked. "Now the children and I were just going up to the house for a bite. We want you to come along with us. We simply won't take no," she laughed, batting her eyes and exposing her bad teeth. I was fascinated by her and wanted to go. Bob seemed unable to cope with the situation and numbly followed. Mrs. Weatherby tripped along in front of us, occasionally pausing to scoop one of the children out of the brush and back onto the path which led up a bank from the beach and into the second growth. The path was littered with empty cans, bottles, discarded clothing, paper, empty boxes, broken furniture, and other junk. The litter grew thicker as we approached the house until we were picking our way through a sizable dump. The path ended. We looked up, and there was the house leering drunkenly at us from its unsteady stilt legs, more cans and bottles pouring from its open door like lava from a crater. "I hope you'll excuse us," called Mrs. Weatherly from the doorway. "I just couldn't bear to be cooped up in the house on such a lovely day, so I left my housework and took the children to the beach." They must have been gone for about 5 years, I thought, judging by the little household tasks which had accumulated in her absence. The tin sink was so covered by dirty dishes and pans and cans and bottles that it was possible to tell it was a sink only by the dripping faucet. The oven door was gone from the rusty range, and the floor, drain boards, chairs, table, wash bench, and an old army cot were hidden entirely by newspapers and magazines. Mrs. Weatherby took a heap of newspapers from 2 rickety chairs, kicked the cans in front of them under the sink, and bade us welcome. "It's been so long since I've entertained anyone but the local folk," she said gaily, "that we're going to have a real treat." She bent over and began fumbling under the sink and finally emerged with a bottle. "It's only Chianti, but it is wine," she laughed, and I noticed that one of the heavy, dusty braids had dipped in something under the sink, for it was wet at the end and dripped. She got jelly glasses from a shelf and filled them, giving each of the slobbering children a little of the wine mixed with water. She said, "The little French children have wine, so why shouldn't Mary Elizabeth, Pamela Lorraine, John Frederick, and baby Charles Lawrence, even though they aren't French?" "Or children," I said grimly to myself. It was a grisly performance because the children were actually drooling idiots, but not so grisly as what was to come. While Bob and I held our wine, trying to gather up enough courage to drink it, Mrs. Weatherby got a stool out of the corner, knocked the carton full of magazines from it to the floor, climbed up on it, and began rummaging around in a high cupboard. As she rustled around up there, I stole a look at Bob. He sat staring at the wine and looking like a man who had just been clipped by an iron pipe. "Oh, here it is," squealed Mrs. Weatherby finally, and down she came, clutching a big gray bundle in her dirty hands. She began slowly and carefully to unroll it, meanwhile telling us the secret. "I made it myself last year," she said. "Yeah, but there was no occasion to warrant my using it, so I wrapped it up and tucked it away. And how glad I am, for fruitcake is so improved with age." She had finished the unrolling, and at first I thought, it can't be. But it was. The fruitcake had been rolled in a rather soiled suit of someone's long underwear. The cake was small and dark, and I prayed that there would not be enough to go around. But Mrs. Weatherby served Bob and me before giving a thin slice to each of the droolers. Then, seating herself on the stool, one elbow on the dirty drainboard of the sink, one hand daintily holding the fruitcake, the fingers of the other carefully encasing the glass of wine, Mrs. Weatherby told us about the quaint folk of that country. She said, "When I first moved up here among these folk, I was dreadfully distressed by the ignorance, the complete absence of any form of culture. I said to Mrs. Weatherby, I don't know how I'm going to go through a winter without the symphony, the theatah, or the Dahnse." She batted her eyes and nibbled at her fruitcake, waiting for my reaction. I said, "What did you do?" She said, "Well, my dear, I organized a study group. We were to meet every other Thursday, like refreshments, you know, and we would study and discuss. Music, I thought, would be the first subject, just simple little melodies at first, then a little stronger and a little stronger, until we were at last able to digest a whole symphony. I had rather an extensive course planned, but it fizzled out. I learned my sorrow," she took a sip of wine, "that these folks are truly simple children of the soil, and they wish to stay that way." I could imagine where Mrs. Kettle had told Mrs. Weatherby to put her symphony and her study group. Mrs. Weatherby continued, "And there's no spirit of cooperation at all. Time and again I've offered to help them put on little things at the schoolhouse, but they are still angry over the hot lunch ruckus and won't have anything to do with me." She waited for her cue, so I said, "What hot lunch ruckus?" She said, "Surely you've heard." "No," I answered. "Well," said Mrs. Weatherby, "it was at one of the Grange meetings, and the women were talking about having a hot lunch served at school. I said, and I had every right, that I could not approve such a program, for I had inspected the school kitchens to be sure they were sanitary. Honestly," said Mrs. Weatherby, "from the uproar that ensued, You would have thought I had questioned the lady's legitimacy. I knew that if I caught Bob's eye, I would explode. So I stood and thanked Mrs. Weatherby for the refreshments, and we left. When we got in the car, Bob said, "That woman, completely nuts." I had an awful foreboding that, given time, I could be like Mrs. Weatherby. Without the idiots, of course. Where had she come from? Who was Mr. Weatherby? What happened to him? Mrs. Kettle, when questioned, said, "Nobody knows where she come from. Sharkey says she washed up on a high tide. She's married to the most worthless drunken Indian in the whole country, and he beats her unconscious every Saturday night. She never tells nothing about herself. When she first come over here, she put on lots of airs and tried to teach us about music. The Theatah and the Dahnse." Mrs. Kettle waved the stove lifter like a baton and half closed her eyes in great disdain. "But her neighbors wouldn't have none of that stuff. And now she stays home in that dump and takes them kids down to play with the clams." Poor Mrs. Weatherby, with nothing in her life but those names: Mary Elizabeth, Pamela Lorraine, John Frederick, and Charles Lawrence. How she rolled them around on her tongue, savoring them to the last drop. I tried rolling Anne Elizabeth around my tongue, but it was too plain and easy. I was safe for a little while yet. My first contact with the Theatah was the grade school Christmas entertainment which I attended with Mrs. Hicks. The entertainment was notable for the smell of manure which came in with and hovered over the audience like a swarm of insects, and a snowflake waltz danced by 10 little jet-black Indians whose only claim to snowiness was the whites of their eyes. Our next brush with the entertainment world was the Dahnse. The Dahnse was a country dance held every Saturday night, week in, week out, year in and year out. Sometimes the dance was 27 miles away, sometimes 25 miles over tortuous mountain roads, but everyone attended. The farmers and their wives and families went because they were Grange members, and often the different Granges sponsored the dances. The farmers and their wives danced, helped with and provided the foods, and behaved themselves. The loggers and mill workers went to the dances to get drunk. They wouldn't for a moment have considered dancing, and after standing on the sidelines and shyly watching for a while, they'd go outside, get uproariously drunk, usually managed to get in a fight, and toward morning could be found either asleep in their cars or in an all-night restaurant in the nearest town. The Indians danced, drank, and fought at the dances. They were also the cause of the ruling that once inside, you had to stay or pay again. "This," explained Mrs. Hicks, who escorted us to our first dance, "is to keep couples from dancing one dance and then going out to their cars to drink and you know what." "Know what?" Bob said wickedly. It was late September of the second year before we felt the need or the urge to go to a dance. And even then, it was not Bob's idea, but "A dance every 2 years or so won't spoil you for the simple life," he laughed and told the Hicks we would go with them. Having never been to a country dance in all my life, I didn't know what to wear, but when I asked Bob, he got his voile and leghorn look. So I wore a suit and my hurdy alligator pumps, and realized as soon as we arrived that I could have worn anything from a house dress to a crumpled taffeta party dress. Mrs. Hicks had on a blue flowered print, a touch of orange lipstick, stiff dippy waves low on her forehead, and lots of bright pink rouge scrubbed into her cheeks. Her stockings were deep orange service weight, and she had her feet encased in long black patent leather slippers with high heels, which made her walk with her behind stuck out. Mr. Hicks wore his town suit, the tightest collar in the world, and a remarkable hairdo, wherein the hair was parted in the middle, wet down thoroughly, while from each side a small group of front hairs were laid back, as though they were to be fastened with barrettes. It gave him a look of careful elegance, which was unfortunately marred by a strong smell of Lysol. Mrs. Hicks probably made him put it in his bathwater. Mrs. Hicks was wearing Raleigh No. 5 in Lysol. Bob was well-groomed, divinely handsome, and a little drunk. We arrived at the dance hall, a large square building, at 8:30 exactly. There seemed to be hundreds of cars from which people were disembarking while shouting to people in other cars, calling anxiously to children who were climbing on radiators over fenders and into other cars. There was apparently no system to the parking. You just drove into the yard wherever you could and turned off the motor. Mrs. Hicks, however, directed Mr. Hicks to a spot at the back of the hall near a side road so that we could leave whenever we wanted to. We walked around to the front, past several parked cars where couples were already in the back seat drinking, and up on the porch where the tickets were sold. As soon as Bob had the tickets, he gave them to a doorman who stamped "paid" in purple ink on the backs of our hands, and we went inside. The dance hall was very large and brilliantly lighted, festooned with dusty green and pink crepe paper streamers, heated to approximately 90 degrees and packed with dancers. The orchestra on a raised platform in the center of the hall consisted of a piano, accordion, violin, trumpet, and saxophone manned by hard-working, sweaty musicians. The music was very loud. Along each of the four walls ran a bench piled high with coats, and, as I discovered later, sleeping children of various ages. During intermission, I watched mothers shuffle through the coats until they found their child, hurriedly change its diapers, and as often as not, whip out a large breast and nurse the baby through the next dance. We found a vacant place on a bench, took off our coats and folded them. Bertie Hicks scrubbed a great deal more of the rouge into her cheeks, and we were ready. Bob and I danced the first dance, which was one of those double quick hops that are the delight of country dancers. We stood it for a few minutes, then retired to the sidelines. While we watched the twirling and hopping, Bob warned me that I was to dance with anyone who asked me, as even a faint display of choosiness would brand me as a snob and immediately and irrevocably ruin my social career. As that dance ended, Bob wandered over to speak to some of his logger friends, and I stood ready to obey his wishes and dance with the first person who asked me. Of course, the first person who asked me was a tiny Filipino, Manuel Lizardo, who rolled his R's so that I could barely understand him and was so short I could hardly hear him. He had his trousers pulled up to his armpits, and we must have made a striking couple. As we danced around the floor, me crouching like a broody hen over Manuel, who, with his head thrown back and teeth all exposed, was entertaining me with witticisms about the music is so loud, it sounds like a yard animals. After he had stood on his tiptoes and screamed at me for the fourth time, I understood and laughed dutifully. Bob oozed by like an oil slick, with a very beautiful, bad-looking Indian girl plastered so tightly to him that I expected to see the print of her dress rubbed off on his jacket when they disentangled. I tried to catch his eye, but he was intent on his work and didn't look up. As each dance ended, the dancers joined hands and marched around and around the floor until the music began again, or there was an exchange of partners. By the end of the third straight dance, Manuel had lost his smile and given up the wit, and I was wondering what every other woman at the dance had, which I seemed to lack. When Mr. Hicks came to our rescue, he grabbed me firmly around the waist, leaned forward, and strode purposefully around the hall. The result was that I was bending way over backward, doing little running steps on my toes between Mr. Hicks's legs and expecting momentarily to do a backflip over his iron arm. The music stopped at last, and I begged to sit out the next dance. Mr. Hicks gallantly offered to sit out with me, but was immediately claimed by Bertie's mother, who came skipping up in a pink taffeta dress and little dirty white canvas strap slippers. "Can't bear to sit out a single dance, too full of pep," she tittered as Mr. Hicks set his vase and strode away. As they passed by the first time, I saw that mother had relaxed like a scarf over the arm, her little fluffy head bobbed spasmodically, and the little dirty white canvas slippers made jerky, futile attempts to reach the floor. Cousin June floated by with Manuel, and judging by the teeth and ho-ho-ha-ha-ha-ha's, Greek had met Greek. All around the edge of the floor, children danced and wrestled and fought and banged into the dancers. Women danced together, and sometimes 3 people would dance together, screaming with laughter at their originality. Everyone was having a wonderful time. Suddenly, the music stopped, and the entire crowd and orchestra surged to one end of the hall, where the bad Indian girl and some farmer's wife were pulling each other's hair and smearing each other with richly appropriate epithets such as cross-eyed daughter of an egg-raising whore and dirty clam-eating black bitch. The Indian girl was the drunkest, so she was put out. The music began again, and we danced until supper. Supper, served at midnight in the basement on long tables, consisted of hamburgers, potato salad, cake, ice cream, and big mugs of coffee. After supper, I danced twice with Bob and once with a very drunk sailor who called me a very poor sport because I refused to let him lower me by the ankles from a window where a pal of his waited with a drink some 20 feet below. "I'm disappointed in you," he said, blinking and swaying. "I'm sorry," I said, "but my husband is very strict with me." Then I saw Bertie's mother across the room, coiled and waiting for her next partner. I grabbed the sailor and gave him a little shove in her direction. "That little lady over there in the pink dress is just the person you're looking for," I told him. "I know she'd love to get a drink from your pal." Whether Mother was lowered out the window to pal, I never knew, for we left while they were still dancing, but I can picture her flipping out the window and up and down between Blue Jacket and pal like a yo-yo on a string. So much pep. As we started the long drive home, Mrs. Hicks began tossing us back bits of gossip picked up at the dance. The last I remember was, "And Mrs. Cartwright's son's wife, Helen, lost her mother and then a tube and both ovaries." I wondered drowsily if she had lost them at the dance and then fell asleep with my nose buried in Bob's shoulder, which smelled of cheap Indian perfume. The most outstanding of all 5 of the social events to which we were invited during our stay in the mountains was Mrs. Kettle's birthday dinner. We were the only outsiders asked, which was a singular honor. It was a Kettle gathering on Kettle soil, and our first introduction to them en masse. One very hot July morning, Mr. Kettle and Elwyn drove up to the house to borrow some egg mash. I invited them in for a cup of coffee, but Pa refused. He said, "Sir would like to, but you see, it's Ma's birthday tomorrow, and Elwyn and I are trying to get a little help with the haying, so we will be free to celebrate. You suppose that Bob could spare us a little time?" I said, "Bob is working on the water system, and I know he won't be able to help. What about the other boys? Can't they help?" Elwyn said, "Ha ha ha, help with the haying? They gotta work in the woods." Pa said, "That's the way it goes. The boys won't help, and the old lady can't do it all alone." I said, "I thought you and Elwood were going to do the haying." Elwood said defensively, "I gotta get my car fixed before Saturday." Pa said, "Mr. Olson cut your hay last year, and Ma raked and stacked it. I was having terrible trouble with my back. But seeing as how tomorrow is Ma's birthday, We thought we'd give a little supper party for her, and we want you folks to come. But she'll be so busy, she won't have a chance to help with the haying. I repeated again firmly. I know Bob won't have time to help with the haying. Well, that's too bad, said Pa. But don't forget to come to supper. I won't, I said. What time? Oh, about 4:30, said Pa. By the way, everyone bring a little something to the party. Sort of a picnic style. I'll bring the birthday cake, I said, which evidently satisfied Pa, for he and Elwyn took their egg mash and left. They came up again in September to solicit help with that same hay. I was not an expert cake baker, but decided to make up insides what it would undoubtedly lack in quality. None of my recipe books contained any directions for anything over 2 layers, so I doubled and tripled, and before evening I had the great heavy square foundation layer done. The next day dawned hazy but warm, a perfect day for a party and a perfect morning to bake the rest of the cake, which by noon was finished and frosted pink, white, and blue. It was poisonous but festive looking, and as a final corny touch, I lettered Happy Birthday on one side in red cinnamon drops and stuck an American flag on the top. Bob drove to the crossroads for a pair of silk stockings and a birthday card, and on the way back picked up Bertie to stay with the baby. At 4 o'clock on the dot, we loaded the cake and set off. The farther down the mountain we drove, the hotter it grew, until, by the time we turned into Kettle's yard, it was stifling. The yard was seething with cars, as all of the 15 children, their husbands, wives, children, and in-laws were there. Mrs. Kettle was bright-eyed in a clean pink house dress, which was missing the top 2 buttons in front, so that as she greeted us, I noticed that her large white breasts bobbed to the surface like dumplings in a stew. I handed her our present, and she kissed me, unwrapped the package, and said, "Well, thank God! I don't have to wear those damn little stockings no more." She directed me to put the cake on the front porch where we were to eat. I carried it through the dark front hall and out the never-used front door and set it, with a thump, on the long table of boards on sawhorses which had been set up and covered with a pink crepe paper tablecloth anchored with rocks. Almost all of the chicken droppings had been scraped from the floor and railing, and the live black bushes cast cool shadows across the table. 2 of the fly paper curls had been suspended from the ceiling, and already they were dotted with flies and swayed and quivered as more hit and stuck. The little flag on my cake drooped as the icing grew warm and soft, and the happy birthday seemed about to slide off at one end, so I moved it farther into the shade before returning to the hot kitchen and the mobs of guests. As I left the porch, I noted that, whether we had counted on it or not, the outhouse was going to be noticeably present at supper. So I suggested when I went to the kitchen that someone put up some sort of temporary door across its front. Mrs. Kettle said, "It's a good idea, but I don't think you'll get any of the men to do it for you. Go shout at them. They're on the back porch." I shouted. But the men were busy drinking blackberry wine, moonshine, dandelion wine, and beer, and comparing notes on guns and hunting. And the only answer I got to my request was a look of annoyance at my interruption from Bob. We women drank coffee while we made potato salad, cut the meatloaf, opened pickles, and sliced bread. It was stifling in the crowded kitchen, but we had to build up the fire to bake the rolls and boil the fresh coffee. I opened the door to the parlor, hoping to release a cross-current of air. But the children immediately crowded into this new area, so Mrs. Kettle got up, firmly shooed them out, and locked the door. The sanctity of the parlor was not threatened even on her birthday. The children raced from the kitchen through the hall, out the front door, off the porch, around the house, up on the back porch, and through the kitchen again. They dodged under hot platters, stuck their fingers in the jam, and got whacked. Rolled on the floor with the dogs, came to get their panties unbuttoned or buttoned, and tattled. The big rocker by the stove held a succession of mothers suckling babies, while the other chairs supported the ample behinds of helpers and cooks. The talk was about sex, logging, sex, cooking, sex, sewing, sex, salaries, sex, fits, and just plain sex. Every four-letter word I had ever heard, and many I had never heard, were employed singly and in unusual combinations. In anger or only slight irritation, the children were called such unbelievably filthy names that in comparison, quote, dirty little bugger, end quote, and, quote, Christly son of a bitch, end quote, and, quote, striking bastard, end quote, seemed terms of affection and endearment. Never have I encountered a group that needed heart medicine more, unless perhaps it was the men who, Bob told me, when they weren't slipping from the porch to siphon gas or lift any loose tools, radiator caps or gear shift knobs from each other's cars, were loudly relating incidents to exhibit their sex prowess either before or after marriage. Mrs. Cattle laughed occasionally, but she was plainly embarrassed, as was I. We cut up the potatoes and hard-boiled eggs and talked about canning, and were both very relieved when the enormous granite coffee pot finally began to boil, and it was time to set the table and carry out the food. Everyone on the back porch was, by that time, quite drunk, and their voices had become loud and a little quarrelsome. A small boy, a little bully who had been causing a great deal of unhappiness among the younger children, came screaming up from the barnyard, where he had been chased but unfortunately not eaten by an old sow. Ma sent Elwyn to fetch Mr. Kettle from the barn, and we all filed out to the porch for supper. When everyone was seated, I suggested that we sing Happy Birthday. This was a mistake. I realized too late, for they followed Happy Birthday with Show Me the Way to Go Home, and a dirty version of Little Red Wing. Ma interrupted this last by banging on the table with her fork and demanding quiet. Everybody cheered and said, "That's telling 'em, Ma," and began passing food. Elwyn had said that Pa would be right up, but we were well into the ice cream before he finally appeared. To protect him from the flies, he had put on and pulled far down over his eyes a black straw hat of Mrs. Kettle's. From its crown bobbed a large pink rose. To shield him from draughts, he had thrust his arms into a jade green knitted coat dress with a full pleated skirt. The skirt must have interfered with the milking, for he had taken a deep hem in it with horse blanket pins, giving the effect of a ballet skirt. He also wore a black work shirt, dungarees, and hip boots, and was smoking a cigar. Choking in an effort to control my laughter until the others had seen the joke, I glanced at Bob, but he shook his head at me warmingly. Amazed, I looked around the table. Not one soul seemed to think there was anything unusual in Pa's dress. He clumped around the table, smiling happily at everyone, climbed into the chair beside Mrs. Kettle by swinging one manure boot carelessly over that end of the table, and she said only, "You took so long with milking your coffees cold." "Pa, Helen, this here's a new dress Bert sent me from New York. Ugly color, ain't it?" After supper, the men returned to the back porch. We women put the food away and washed the dishes, and Bob and I left just as a sizable fight started over who had stolen whose car. The cake was a great success. We seldom went to the movies for two very sound reasons. One, it meant driving from 70 to 100 miles. Two, we had to get up at 4 o'clock the next morning. In addition to these, Bob complained that his legs were too long for comfort in any theater seat. He always slept through everything but the news. And I became so biased that no matter how melodramatic the plot, I watched only to see if the heroine did any work or if she seemed to have all of the inconveniences of modern life. If she didn't work and seemed to have plenty of opportunity to take big, hot, steamy, fragrant baths, I lost all interest in the plot. Under such circumstances, who gave a damn who got the man? I will go to a fair any time. A fair, to me, is the ultimate in entertainment, something of interest for everyone, all the time in the world to enjoy it, and so many delightful smells: popcorn, coffee, molasses candy, and wet sawdust. For years our family made an all-day visit to the Western Washington Fair at Puyallup, but we treated the trip purely as entertainment. We had no active part in it, and we paid no attention to prize ribbons other than in the flower department, where Mother forced us to wait while she bought bulbs and seeds. I entered our county fair with such an entirely different viewpoint that it was as if I had never been to a fair before. The county fair was held near town in late September. Town was in an old little dry belt which meandered through that soaking wet country, so there was never any danger of the fair being spoiled by rain, as it was so often at Puyallup. And by the opening day, the dust was ankle deep and had to be hosed down every morning, giving a pleasant spring rain smell to pathways. We attended the fair in true farmer style. I packed dozens of diapers, several bottles, blankets and pillows so the baby could take a nap in the truck, mosquito netting to keep off the flies, extra old shoes for the trip through the animal pens, and we were on the highway by 8 in the morning. It was chilly and foggy in the mountains, but town was flooded with bright sunshine and whipped by salty breezes. The water was deep blue and lacy with white caps. The mountains were pale blue and white with sharp outlines. The hills were soft yellow, and the old red courthouse gazed down on the town with the dignity and benignancy of a cathedral. Despite the early hour, there were many other cars and trucks on the road. When we turned into the fairgrounds, we found as much activity as though it were late afternoon. We parked the truck under a large balm of Gilead tree near the restaurant. I divested Anne of her knitted leggings, put on my old shoes, and we were ready. The first thing, of course, was to have a cup of coffee and some fresh homemade donuts. At stools along the counter on either side of us were other farmers and their wives and children. The other babies were being given sips of coffee and bites of the hot, greasy donuts. I felt hard and godly as I ate and drank with Anne's round blue eyes following each sip and bite like a puppy. After the coffee, we went to the poultry show. Of course, we thought that some of the white leghorns that had won blue ribbons weren't a bit better than our own hens. Bob was much interested in the Australorps, black chickens which were supposed to lay as well as white leghorn and yet be as fine a table bird as the Rhode Island red or barred rock. It sounded too good to be true, but the farmer who exhibited swore that they were the most remarkable discovery since electricity. From the poultry houses, we went to the pig pens, which were more pleasant in the early morning. Then to the sheep, goats, and rabbits. By this time, Anne was getting sleepy, so I took her back to the car and left Bob with instructions to meet me at the restaurant at noon. I fastened Anne to the seat of the car with a blanket under and over her and pinned to the upholstery, stretched the mosquito netting from the back of the seat to the steering wheel, and she immediately and obligingly went to sleep. I spent the rest of the morning in the canning and fancy work exhibits. I felt a surge of pride when I saw that Bertie Hicks had won blue ribbons on all of her canning and that Mrs. Kettle's quilts were prominently displayed. There were some really beautiful hooked and braided rugs, and some perfectly hideous ones made of gunny sacks, fringed and coated with yarn and forced through the mesh and tied in knots. I remember seeing instructions for these in one of the farm magazines. There was a pen and ink drawing of the rug, showing it with a nap of about 8 inches. Underneath it said, "There is beauty in even the common grain sack." There is too, but not when it has been disfigured with yarny knots. There were other ingenious uses for everyday objects. There was a Sears Roebuck catalog painfully twisted and shellacked and tied with a red cord. The white card beneath it said, quote, "An inexpensive doorstop," end quote, Ethelyn Weatherby. I made a mental note to ask someone if that was, quote, "our Mrs. Weatherby," end quote. There were ketchup bottles made into bud vases, clothespins decorated with crepe paper butterflies for use as curtain hold backers, crocheted bags for silverware, bouquets of crepe paper and velvet flowers, an enormous funeral set piece of white organdy gardenias and dark green oilcloth leaves with "Rest in Peace" spelled out in white pipe cleaners, embroidered pictures, burned wood matchboxes, and fancy pillows by the hundreds. The pillows embraced every sentiment from "Frankie and Johnny were lovers" in black beads on a cerise satin background to the 23rd Psalm in white on black velvet. It was an impressive exhibit of what loneliness can do to people.